They didn't arrive with the flags you expect. No NATO insignia. No Western anthem. Yet their presence shook the very spine of the Sahel. Under the orange glow of dawn, convoys of freshly painted armored beasts rolled across Ouagadougou. Their desert camouflage hiding not just steel, but a shift in power no one saw coming. For years, Africa's skies and roads were filled with the West's machines, their contracts, their conditions. But now, from the east, another giant has moved in, fast, silent, and with promises whispered in the corridors of power. The question is not who sold the weapons. The question is, what was promised in return? Because behind every gun barrel, every rocket tube, every armored plate, there's always a signature in invisible ink. Stay until the end. Because what we uncovered about these deals, and the strings that may be attached, will change the way you see Africa's new war machines. If you believe sovereignty is worth defending, do not just watch, be part of this conversation. Like, comment, subscribe, the truth begins now. In late July, Burkina Faso's military confirmed the arrival of Chinese-manufactured VN-22B fire support vehicles. PLL-05 self-propelled gun mortars, and SR-5 multiple rocket launch systems, all from Norinco, Beijing's defense titan. The footage was unmistakable, desert and tropical camouflage. Crews in new fatigues, convoys moving under tight security. Days later, Mali received its own shipment, armored convoys rolling in from Guinea toward Bamako. On paper, it was modernization. In reality, it was a message. A message to old powers that the Sahel's arsenal was no longer theirs to dictate. And that message is only the first shot in a battle that will not be fought on sand alone. The sun had barely climbed above Ouagadougou when the first rumble reached the streets. It was not the sound of a market opening, nor the chatter of morning prayers. It was the metallic growl of engines built an ocean away. Now claiming the heart of West Africa. Mothers paused at their stalls, children froze mid-game, men shaded their eyes as shadows of armored giants passed. Each vehicle was more than steel. It was a statement. This was Captain Ibrahim Traoré's answer to a question the West had been asking for decades: who arms Africa when Africa refuses to kneel? The VN-22Bs rolled by. Their desert camouflage a near match to the earth itself, their turrets swiveling as if scanning not just the streets but the future. Beside them, the PLL-05 self-propelled mortars, capable of delivering both high explosive and smoke rounds, seemed to carry the unspoken message: we can see you before you see us. And then came the SR-5 rocket launchers, each one a reminder that the Sahel's reach was growing longer. This was not a parade. There were no brass bands, no speeches, no foreign advisors in tailored suits. The only soundtrack was the roar of engines and the whisper among the crowd: they came from China. It was not said with fear. It was said with a kind of guarded curiosity, a question hanging in the dust: would these machines serve the people? Or the next master? For decades, the Sahel had been a chessboard where outside powers moved pieces at will. The West offered weapons, but always with fine print, reforms dictated in Paris. Human rights checklists written in Washington, conditions that often had less to do with morality than with control. The deals came with loans, and the loans came with chains. But these convoys from Beijing, they came with no public conditions. No lectures. Just steel, speed, and a handshake. Traoré's modernization plan, announced in 2023, was no empty slogan. He had seen the cost of fighting insurgents with outdated, mismatched equipment, the funerals, the villages abandoned, the soldiers left without proper armor. He had vowed that Burkina Faso's army would be ready for intense engagements. And in the Sahel, that phrase was not metaphor. It meant firefights in the scrublands, ambushes on desert roads, raids against camps that shifted like smoke. In the American South, there is a saying: don't bring a knife to a gunfight. In the Sahel, it's more like, don't bring a pickup truck to a war fought with drones and rocket artillery. The Chinese vehicles filled that gap, bridging the years of neglect and the urgency of a war that waits for no one. But weapons are never just weapons. They are relationships cast in steel. Every VN-22B, every PLL-05, every SR-5 was a line in a new chapter of African geopolitics, a chapter in which China's shadow loomed larger over the Sahel, and the West's once dominant silhouette began to fade. The question was whether this shadow would shelter or smother. There are moments in history when the tools you choose define the future you inherit. The American Revolution was fought with muskets smuggled from France. Vietnam's wars were shaped by AK-47s from the Soviet bloc. Now, Africa's wars, its fights for sovereignty, may well be fought with Chinese steel. And like every such moment, the decision carries a cost. For the West, these convoys are a warning. For the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, they are a test. A test of whether sovereignty means choosing your own allies, or simply switching captains on the same ship. As the convoy left Ouagadougou, the dust hung in the air like an unanswered question. Children ran after the vehicles, waving. Soldiers waved back, their faces unreadable behind ballistic glass. Somewhere in that exchange, between the innocence of the children and the stoic silence of the soldiers, was the future of the Sahel. If you believe that the courage to choose one's own path is as important as the weapons that defend it, tell us in the comments. Your voice is not just an opinion, it is part of the record. And in the story of sovereignty, the record matters. On the battlefield of geopolitics, firepower is only the first layer. The deeper war is fought over supply chains, financing terms, training programs, and, most importantly, loyalty. And in the Sahel, China is playing a game the West once thought it had mastered. 3 things make Beijing's offer irresistible to African capitals. The first is price. Western systems like the American Stryker or the French VBCI cost millions more per unit than a Chinese VN-22B. For nations where budgets are stretched between fighting insurgencies and building roads, every million saved can mean another school, another clinic, or another armored vehicle. The second is speed. While Western contracts can take years to negotiate and deliver, Chinese shipments arrive in months, sometimes weeks. The SR-5 multiple rocket launchers that rolled into Ouagadougou this summer were ordered less than a year ago. Compare that to the French Caesar artillery systems, where orders from African nations have sat in production queues behind European customers. The third, and perhaps the most decisive, is the absence of conditions. No lectures about governance. No human rights clauses written to be weaponized later. Beijing does not ask who your political prisoners are, or whether your last election met international standards. For governments under pressure, that kind of silence is golden. But there is a fourth factor, one the West does not like to admit. Chinese equipment is getting better. A decade ago, African armies viewed it as cheap but unreliable. Now, Norinco's armored vehicles and artillery systems have combat records from Asia to the Middle East. They are not just inexpensive, they are proven. Mali's army, for instance, now fields Chinese armored vehicles alongside drones from Turkey. In Ivory Coast, mine-resistant vehicles from China patrol the same roads as French-made APCs. Gabon has quietly integrated Chinese artillery into its rapid reaction forces. And Kenya, a longtime Western partner, now deploys Chinese MRAPs in its northern border zones. Russia remains a heavyweight. Its AK rifles, Mi-series helicopters, and T-72 tanks are staples across the continent. Its Wagner, now rebranded in Africa, brings both hardware and fighters. But Russia's own war in Ukraine has strained its capacity to supply Africa at the pace China offers. Turkey is the wild card. The Bayraktar TB2 drones have become the symbol of Ankara's rise in Africa. 11 nations now fly them, and Turkey's armored vehicle manufacturers are moving fast. Yet even Ankara's agility cannot match the sheer scale of China's manufacturing machine. For the West, the optics are brutal. Paris, Washington, and Brussels once dictated the security menu for African nations. Now they are watching as China not only serves the main course but sets the table. And the table is in the Sahel, a region the West once considered its strategic backyard. This shift is not just about arms sales. It is about who African soldiers train with, whose doctrine they learn, whose spare parts keep their vehicles rolling. The VN-22B in Ouagadougou today is not just a machine, it is a seed. In 5 years, its crew will be veterans trained in Chinese maintenance protocols, thinking in terms of Chinese operational design. And once a military thinks in a certain language, tactical or literal, it is very hard to change. In the American Civil War, generals trained at West Point often found themselves fighting against each other because their loyalties split, but their methods remained the same. Now imagine African armies trained in Beijing's methods. The alliances they form, the strategies they adopt, the conflicts they choose to fight, all will carry that imprint. And yet, the question remains, is this a new dawn for African sovereignty, or just a change in the flag over the armory? Beijing's no-conditions approach is attractive now, but power always seeks return on investment. The absence of visible strings does not mean there are none. In the markets of Bamako and Ouagadougou, traders talk about the convoys as if they are omens. Some see them as the tools that will finally break the West's grip. Others whisper about future debts, not in money, but in loyalty. The kind of loyalty that can be called upon in a United Nations vote, or in a regional crisis where Beijing's interests are at stake. This is the razor's edge Africa walks now. With each VN-22B deployed, each SR-5 launcher tested, the military balance shifts. But so does the political balance. In the halls of power, one truth holds: whoever supplies your guns shapes your choices. If you have been watching until now, understand this: the story is not just about steel and camouflage. It is about the slow rewriting of the Sahel's alliances. And in this rewriting, every deal, every delivery, every handshake is another sentence in a book that will decide who truly owns Africa's future. You may feel pride in seeing African armies stand tall, better equipped than ever. You may feel wary of the new hands on the supply chain. Either way, this moment will be remembered as the pivot. And the pivot point, once passed, cannot be reversed. History has a habit of repeating itself, but it never uses the same handwriting twice. In 1803, the United States made a purchase that would forever change its destiny, the Louisiana Territory. For $15 million, America doubled its size overnight, not through war, but through a deal. The land came with rivers, ports, resources, and, most importantly, strategic depth. But what most history books skip is the quiet consequence: the purchase shifted the balance of power, forcing old empires to redraw their maps. Today, in the Sahel, the deals are not for land but for steel. And yet the principle is the same. Every VN-22B, every PLL-05, every SR-5 delivered is a piece of strategic terrain, not in acres, but in capability. The Sahel's leaders are not just buying machines. They are buying time, leverage, and the right to say no to the wrong kind of help. For decades, Africa's security map was colored by its former colonial rulers. French troops in Mali, American advisors in Niger, European Union training missions in Burkina Faso. Each presence came with banners of partnership, but also with the unspoken understanding that the final say did not rest entirely in African capitals. Now, with Chinese convoys arriving in Ouagadougou and Bamako, that map is being repainted. It is not a wholesale erasure. Russia is still here, Turkey is carving its slice, and the West is not gone. But the brush is in new hands. And the picture that emerges is one where African states can play suppliers against each other, negotiating from a position of choice rather than desperation. Choice is the essence of sovereignty. In American culture, we often equate sovereignty with the ability to defend one's borders. But in truth, it is the ability to choose whose hand you shake, and when to walk away. The Sahel's leaders are learning that lesson in real time. China's appeal lies partly in this flexibility. They do not care if your last election was contested. They will not lecture you on media freedom. For governments under siege, militarily or politically, this is oxygen. For their critics, it is a dangerous indulgence, a blank check that could enable abuses at home. Here lies the paradox. A no-conditions deal feels like freedom at the start. But freedom in geopolitics is rarely free. The Louisiana Purchase expanded America's borders, but it also bound the young republic to defend and develop vast new lands, a responsibility that shaped its politics, its wars, and its identity. The Sahel's new arsenal will demand the same: maintenance contracts, training programs, long-term commitments to suppliers. And once those supply lines are drawn, they become arteries of dependence. In the markets of Gao, Mopti, and Kaya, traders speak of the Chinese vehicles with a mix of pride and pragmatism. They are ours now, one says. But the spare parts will come from far away. That distance is both a shield and a leash. Shields protect, but leashes pull. The West frames this as a trap. African leaders frame it as diversification. The truth may be somewhere in between. What is certain is that the Sahel is no longer content to take what it is given. It is choosing. And choice, in a world where power is often about options, is a weapon in itself. We see the same dynamic in sports. A football team that can switch formations, change its play style, adapt to the opponent, that team controls the game. A nation that can switch arms suppliers, negotiate better terms, and keep rivals guessing, that nation controls its security. In Washington, Paris, and Brussels, the arrival of Chinese steel in the Sahel is read as a defeat. In Beijing, it is logged as a foothold. In Ouagadougou and Bamako, it is recorded as a step towards self-determination. All three can be true at the same time. And therein lies the complexity that the soundbites miss. This is why the conversation about Africa's new partnerships must go beyond fear or celebration. It must ask the hard questions: what is the end game? What does true independence look like when your guns come from one side of the world and your markets from another? The Louisiana Purchase did not make America invincible. It made America accountable to a larger destiny. The Sahel's arms deals will not make AES unbeatable. They will make AES accountable to a future it is now actively shaping. And in that shaping, every citizen, from the soldier behind the turret to the farmer whose village is now within rocket range, has a stake. The convoys that rolled through Ouagadougou and Bamako were not just moving hardware. They were moving the boundary between the Africa that was told what to do, and the Africa that decides for itself. Whether that decision leads to lasting sovereignty or a new kind of dependency will depend on what happens next. If you have been watching this far, you are not just an observer. You are a witness to a pivot in African history. And in moments like this, silence is also a choice. The headlines told one story: African armies modernizing at record speed. But buried deep in the ink of these contracts, far from the cameras, another story waits. It begins not on the battlefield, but in the back rooms where the real deals are sealed. Alongside the armored vehicles and rocket launchers, there are clauses that speak of logistical cooperation, joint maintenance hubs, and extended training exchanges. On paper, they sound harmless, even wise. In practice, they are roots that grow into the soil of sovereignty. A VN-22B does not fight forever on its own. It needs spare parts, specialized tools, software updates. The SR-5 rocket system requires calibration by technicians who know its heart. The PLL-05 mortars' range and accuracy depend on maintenance cycles that follow a manual written in Mandarin. And so, every few months, a container ship will leave a Chinese port, bound for the harbors of West Africa, carrying not just parts, but presence. Then there is the training. Officers from Burkina Faso and Mali are already rotating through academies in China, learning the doctrine, the maintenance philosophy, the operational tactics of their suppliers. It is not unusual, America and Europe have done the same for decades. But the imprint left by such training is deep. A soldier taught to think like his supplier will often fight in ways that serve that supplier's worldview. The West calls this soft control. China calls it partnership. The line between the two is thin. And it shifts with time. In some AES war rooms, this reality is understood. We will take the weapons, one advisor to a Sahelian president told me, but we will not surrender the command. Yet history warns that dependence creeps, silent as a shadow at dusk. The more your army relies on a single source for its lifeblood, the harder it becomes to turn elsewhere when the winds change. In American history, alliances forged in crisis have sometimes become shackles in peace. After World War II, the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but it also anchored its economies to American influence for generations. Now, Africa stands on a similar threshold. The deals with Beijing may shield it from the old colonial grip, but they could also weave a new net, spun from steel and logistics. And perhaps that is the unspoken genius, or danger, of China's play. They do not need to plant a flag on African soil. The supply lines are the flag. The maintenance hubs are the flag. The knowledge embedded in African officers' minds is the flag. This is not a warning against partnership. It is a reminder that every alliance writes obligations in invisible ink. And one day, when a crisis flares in a corner of the world Africa barely thinks about today, that ink may reveal itself in the form of a quiet but firm request from Beijing. The convoys in Ouagadougou and Bamako looked like victory parades. But history teaches us, not every parade ends at the city square. Some march straight into the next obligation. In the end, sovereignty is not a gift. It is not bought with one deal, or won in a single battle. It is carved, day by day, from the choices a nation makes, and the costs it is willing to bear. The Sahel's roads now carry machines that did not roll here under Western banners. That is a change worth noting. But the greater question is, will those roads lead to freedom, or to another gate with another guard? History will not remember the paint on these vehicles. It will remember who they served, and whether their steel protected a people's will, or someone else's design. If you believe that Africa's future must be decided in African capitals, not in foreign boardrooms, then make your voice part of this moment. Like, comment, subscribe, and share this story. Because the fight for sovereignty is not theirs alone. It is ours. And it will be won only if we keep the fire burning, together.